Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Buenas tardes a todos. I'd like to welcome you all to Benengeli, Semana Internacional de las Letras en Español 2024. To get things started, I'd like to call Dr. Marlon James Sales, Coordinator of Graduate Studies, Department of European Languages, UP Diliman, to give us a few words.
They've asked me to deliver the opening remarks in Spanish, so I'll do this in Spanish partly and then some parts in English as well. La doctora profesora Judy Ig, directora del Departamento de Inglés y Literatura Comparada de la Universidad de Filipinas, José María Fons, el gestor cultural del Instituto Cervantes de Manila, Carlos Balmaceda, el bibliotecario, nuestros dos autores invitados, Dean Francis Alfar y Luis García Jambrina, Andrea Pasión Flores de Mil Flores Publishing, que hará de moderadora el día de hoy, don Chaco Molina, nuestro intérprete, apreciados compañeros y amigos de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la Universidad de Filipinas, queridos alumnos, hispanistas, invitados y amantes de la literatura y del español. En nombre de la profesora Niña Rachel Alcawili, nuestra directora del Departamento de Lenguas Europeas, y del doctor Miguel Blázquez, coordinador de la sección de español, y de todos los profesores de la sección, tengo el honor de darles la bienvenida a este hermoso e histórico Museo Jorge Vargas de la Universidad de Filipinas con motivo de la segunda edición del Festival Literario Benengeli, que esta semana se está celebrando en varias ciudades del mundo, donde el Instituto Cervantes tiene una presencia institucional. La etapa que nos corresponde el día de hoy aquí en la Universidad de Filipinas de este festival tiene más trascendencia este año porque, como bien sabéis, el Instituto Cervantes celebra el 30 aniversario de su fundación este año. El Instituto Cervantes de Manila ha sido y es nuestro fiel aliado en el Departamento de Lenguas Europeas de la Universidad de Filipinas, el único centro de enseñanza superior en Filipinas que ofrece programas de español desde el grado hasta el doctorado, por lo que nos llena de orgullo y esperanza ver lo mucho que hemos hecho juntos para promocionar, difundir y custodiar el valioso patrimonio hispano que une Filipinas con el resto de un mundo que celebra con nosotros esta Semana de Literatura. I am personally delighted to note that we are able to conduct this public event with the help of the Department of English and Comparative Literature, a model department that we look up to in the Department of European Languages, whom we thank for their generosity and availability, proving time and again that the most effective way we can advance our research and training agendas is if we work collaboratively, seeing our disciplinary overlaps as a necessary feature of a healthy academic life. It is noteworthy that we are gathered this afternoon to talk about literature with two outstanding writers, Filipino author and Carlos Palanca Award winner Dean Francis Alfar, and Spanish author and academic Luis García Jambrina, who visits us from the Universidad de Salamanca in Spain. It is equally noteworthy that the topic of their conversation, Géneros para retratar el caos, or genres to depict chaos, could not have come at a better time. In an age when dystopias seem to have escaped the realm of speculation to become our everyday reality, literature provides us with critical tools to grapple with chaos, while at the same time consoling us with the thought that, as with any work of fiction, this too shall pass. With the help of our able moderator, Andrea Pasión Flores of Mil Flores Publishing, I am sure that our conversation this afternoon will be a timely provocation that draws us closer to the events of literature and creates spaces for personal introspection and critique. Por todo ello, reitero, nuestra más cordial bienvenida para todos ustedes, con el deseo que el encuentro literario que con gusto acogemos aquí en la Universidad de Filipinas el día de hoy les brinde muchos momentos de reflexión e iluminación. Muchas gracias a todos. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat.
Muchísimas gracias, Dr. Sales, por esas palabras tan bonitas. Also, to give us a few words today, I would like to call Dr. Judy Celine Ick, Chairperson of the Department of English and Comparative Literature, University of the Philippines, Diliman. Dr. Ick.
Thank you very much. Yesterday, the Department of English and Comparative Literature celebrated its 114th Foundation Day, our anniversary. It's a department that's been around for 114 years, and it speaks to, it's only 2 years younger than the university itself. And it speaks to a deep love that we have for literature and literary studies, a love that we share with the Department of European Languages, with whom we have almost familial relations. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Department of European Languages began as a Department of Spanish, which was founded by Professor Abad, Antonio Abad, who is the father of Phil-Hispanic literature, who is also the literal father of Gemino Abad, our Professor Emeritus and national artist, and his mother, and Professor Antonio Abad's wife, Jesusa, was Profesora Jesusa Abad, who also taught with the European Languages Department and was my Espanol 1 teacher. So I'm not kidding about familial ties. So anyway, we're very happy to be co-hosting this event with the Department of European Languages. Many of their majors take our subjects as electives, and we send most of our majors to that department for their language training. And this afternoon's event is just one more example of this long history of cooperation and practically familial ties we share with EL. So, good afternoon to everyone. I hope you enjoy this afternoon's lecture. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much, Dr. Iek. Antes de comenzar el coloquio esta tarde, I would like to call on Mr. José María Fons, gestor cultural del Instituto Cervantes, para contarnos sobre el evento Benengeli y para presentar a nuestra moderadora y nuestros ponentes hoy. José.
Hola, buenas tardes. Magandang hapon, señor Lahat. Muchas gracias por venir. Thank you for coming. Bien, ante todo, gracias a UPI, al Departamento de Lenguas Europeas de UPI, por organizar con nosotros este acto en esta universidad que tanto apreciamos. Organizado por el Instituto Cervantes, Benengeli 2024, la Semana de Literatura en Español, es el único festival literario que cubre 5 continentes. Organized by Instituto Cervantes, Benengeli is the only festival of literature covering 5 continents worldwide. Sorry if I'm, from now on, let me speak in Spanish because this is going to be translated, broadcast to all the network, and our colleagues in Sydney were already using Spanish, so we have to adapt to the whole. So I hope you don't mind. It's going to be short anyway. Starting yesterday, el festival empezó ayer, el 10 de junio. Durará 5 días hasta el viernes 14. En estos 5 días, más de 100 escritores de 30 países van a hablar, van a tratar en 12 centros de la red Cervantes sobre literatura, sobre un tema común, que es literatura y humor, entendido en un sentido amplio. Los centros de Sydney, Manila, Budapest, Utrecht, Bruselas, Toulouse, Manchester, Madrid Casablanca, Río de Janeiro, Sao Paulo y Belo Horizonte, todos contribuiremos a una conversación general sobre la literatura. Este evento de Manila, este coloquio de Manila, está organizado por el Instituto Cervantes en colaboración con la Embajada de España y la Universidad de Filipinas, con el Departamento de Lenguas Europeas y con el Departamento de Inglés y Escritura Creativa. Así que muchas gracias a nuestros compañeros de ambos departamentos por su ayuda. El tema de hoy, el tema de este coloquio, géneros para retratar el caos, nos van a mostrar diferentes aproximaciones a la literatura de género de dos autores, uno español y otro filipino. Dean Francis Alfar, muchas gracias Francis por aceptar la invitación, y Luis García Jambrina, que es novelista como Dean y profesor de literatura española en la Universidad de Salamanca. Muchas gracias también, Luis, por aceptar nuestra invitación y venir a Manila. Él llegó ayer y todavía no ha sucumbido al jet lag. O sea que todo bravo. Muy bien. El coloquio va a ser moderado, será moderado por una gran amiga de la casa, del Instituto Cervantes de Manila, con quien ya hemos hecho algunos proyectos anteriores, la escritora, editora Andrea Pasión Flores. Andrea participó el año pasado en Benengeli y gracias a su colaboración publicamos para el festival y se presentó durante el festival este libro, esta antología de escritores españoles y latinoamericanos, 6 escritores españoles y latinoamericanos, por primera vez traducidos al filipino. Es Manga Papel ni Benengeli, y en ella hay, ya digo, 6 escritores. Por mi parte, eso es lo único que quiero. Quería señalar este libro de Dean Francis Alfar. Curiosamente se llama Salamanca, la ciudad de donde viene Luis, que tiene una serie de novelas centradas en Salamanca. Y curiosamente ha sido una casualidad, pero nos ha venido estupendo para ponerlos ambos en relación. Solo voy a leerles, permítanme, un extracto de la novela para presentar a Luis, que es nuestro escritor invitado, El manuscrito de piedra. Es una novela muy interesante que es una novela de crimen, de corte histórico, en la que hay que discernir varios asesinatos en la Salamanca del siglo XV, ¿verdad? Es a finales del XV, se sitúa. Sí. El primero de ellos es el asesinato de un padre dominico, o sea que a ustedes el tema les resultará algo familiar, ¿no? El protagonista es Fernando de Rojas, que es el supuesto autor de la Celestina, y les voy a leer un trozo. I'm going to read just one excerpt from the novel in Spanish, but I promise it's going to be very short. I mean, it's just, si me conocieras un poco, le advirtió Rojas, sabrías de sobra que nunca aceptaría ningún trato contigo, aunque me fuera la vida en ello. El problema no es si yo te conozco o te desconozco, sino hasta qué punto te conoces tú. Nadie sabe, mientras no llega el momento, lo que es capaz de hacer en determinadas situaciones. Yo, no hace mucho, me ganaba bien la vida con mis pupilas, mis tercerías y mis trapicheos, y mira en lo que me he convertido por culpa de unos canallas. En cuanto a mi estudiante, no quiero que le guardes ningún rencor. En mi vida he visto a nadie matar de una forma tan desinteresada y al mismo tiempo con tanta afición, que hasta parece que nació para ello. y cómo cuida los detalles. Tanto que una vez le dije, pero hombre, ¿por qué te esfuerzas en adornar los crímenes si nadie lo va a saber apreciar? En eso te equivocas, me replicó él. Al fin y al cabo, Salamanca es la cuna de todas las artes. Es una ciudad llena de arte, como pueden ver. Bien, pues con ese trozo, con ese extracto de la novela, les dejo en compañía de Andrea, de los dos escritores, y les deseo un interesante coloquio y una feliz semana literaria. Bienvenidos a Benengeli 2024. Gracias. Y perdón, porque el plan era que yo ahora tenía que... sorry, because the plan is now I must introduce Andrea, to give the floor to Andrea. Please, Andrea, when you go ahead, when you want to. Thank you.
Gracias, Jose. So first, I'd like to thank Jose and the Instituto Cervantes for inviting me and for the privilege of sitting between these two great authors. So I'm going to dive right in and start first by introducing the authors, which actually Jose already did a little bit of by introducing both of them. Okay, so first I will start with Luis Garcia Hambrina, who is a multi-awarded writer of essays, stories, and novels. He's a literary critic, a professor, and a doctor of Hispanic philology from the University of Salamanca. He is a professor at this same university, which is an activity, a profession he combines with his work as a literary critic for the Spanish daily newspaper ABC. He is the author of many novels, but I think the novels that we are interested in today are his crime novels. In particular, the series that involve Fernando de Rojas, and he has 6, if I'm not mistaken. El manuscrito de piedra, el manuscrito de nieve, el manuscrito de fuego, el manuscrito de aire, el manuscrito de barro, el manuscrito de niebla. Do I have all? Okay. And another interesting one based on Miguel de Unamuno, El Primero Caso de Unamuno. So these are very intriguing novels, crime novels, based on real historical figures. And then next we have on my left, Dean Francis Alfar, a multi-awarded playwright, novelist, and writer of speculative fiction, author of the novel Salamanca, which is not what he has in common technically with. From the University of Salamanca, we have Luis, but Salamanca, the magician, we have Dean. No, so aside from his novel, he has 3 collections of short fiction: The Kite of Stars, How to Traverse Tierra Incognita, and A Field Guide to the Roads of Manila. He is the chair of the Manila Critics Circle, which, together with the National Book Development Board, administers the Philippine National Book Awards. Dean is also an entrepreneur managing several businesses, one of them as publisher. He publishes the anthologies Philippine Speculative Fiction and lives in Manila with his wife and 2 daughters. So I'm going to go straight in and dive into the questions of the writer and his milieu. So I'm going to start the first question and address it to Luis. Luis, you write from a very strong sense of place, which is apparently Salamanca. Can you describe Salamanca for us and why you have chosen to set many of your novels, apparently most of or all of your crime novels, in Salamanca, or in particular the University of Salamanca?
Bueno, antes de responder, buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Estoy muy contento de estar aquí en Manila y de estar aquí en esta Universidad de Filipinas. Gracias, por tanto, al Instituto Cervantes por haberme invitado a participar en este festival de Benengeli. Gracias, José Fons, lo has hecho posible, gracias a su director, Javier Galván, gracias a todo el equipo, al brillante equipo del Instituto Cervantes de Manila, gracias a la Universidad de Filipinas por acogernos en este magnífico lugar. Es como si estuviéramos en medio del bosque, pero sin pasar calor, que es para mí muy importante. Es lo que peor estoy llevando de momento, el calor, pero yo creo que me habituaré. Y bueno, gracias a los que comparten la mesa, gracias por tu presentación, por tu labor de moderadora. Bueno, gracias a mi intérprete, sin él no podría manejarme también aquí. Y bueno, encantado de haber conocido a un colega, a Dean Francis Alfar. Alfar es una bonita palabra española.
Sí.
Alfar es el lugar donde se trabaja con el barro, donde trabaja el alfarero, que es el que hace cosas con el barro. O sea, que es una palabra maravillosa. Y bueno, tenemos cosas en común. El nudo es la ciudad de Salamanca. Y bueno, ya empiezo, o te dejo que lo hacemos por partes.
Good luck.
Yes.
Thank you very much and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you to the University of the Philippines. Thank you to Cervantes for having me as part of the Benengeli for 2024. To Jose Portegre, who's been taking care of me, to its director Javier, actually to the whole team of Cervantes. I'd like to thank the university for having this wonderful place that you're having me, where it's in the middle of nature, but minus the temperature, which is what I'm struggling most. So I thank you for the scene and the temperature. I also want. I'm happy to be here with this colleague, with the moderator, and Dean. I think you know this, that your surname is a very important Spanish word, which is the place where the pottery is done. So it's also a very creative name in itself. Harry Potter. Como Harry Potter. Alfarero, Potter, también es verdad. No, es que no alfarero, es el caos. Es el caos, déjate alfarero ya.
Bueno, en cuanto a la pregunta, pues claro, Salamanca es una ciudad muy antigua de España, conocida fundamentalmente por su universidad. Una universidad que tiene 8 siglos, o sea, más de 800 años desde su fundación. Es la más antigua de España y una de las más antiguas de Europa. Por lo tanto, Salamanca es una ciudad universitaria casi desde su origen, ¿no? Como esta, ¿no? En el caso de Salamanca, además, se lo contaba antes a Dean, realmente hay dos ciudades que están marcadas por la universidad. Una es la Salamanca oficial, la Salamanca visible, la Salamanca de la superficie, de la parte de arriba, que es donde está su famosa universidad de 800 años, que se enseñaba teología, leyes, medicina, y por debajo estaba la ciudad subterránea, la ciudad heterodoxa, la ciudad en la que daba clases el diablo. Exacto, el diablo. Por cierto, esta es la cueva de Salamanca. La entrada de la cueva. De modo que es una ciudad que tiene una doble cara, ¿no? La Salamanca conocida, pero también la Salamanca oculta y desconocida. Y un poco eso es lo que yo intenté reflejar en mi novela, en el manuscrito de piedra. Por cierto, la característica física más importante de Salamanca es que la mayor parte de sus edificios, de sus monumentos, pero también de muchas de sus casas, están hechas de piedra. Pero una determinada piedra, se llama piedra de Villamayor, que es una piedra que se arenisca, que se puede trabajar, que se puede labrar fácilmente y con la cual se pueden hacer, pues eso, muchas figuras en las fachadas de los edificios. Bueno, pues eso es básicamente Salamanca. una ciudad donde lo que predominan son los estudiantes en todas las épocas, en la Edad Media y también ahora. Y Salamanca siempre fue el gran foco cultural de España, ¿de acuerdo? A donde iba a estudiar todo el mundo. La mayor parte de los escritores españoles y algunos latinoamericanos de todos los tiempos han pasado por Salamanca, por la Universidad de Salamanca. Algunos han sido profesores, otros han sido alumnos, o las dos cosas, empezando por Fernando de Rojas, que estudió, el autor de la Celestina, que estudió leyes en Salamanca, pero casi todos. El único que no estuvo en Salamanca fue Cervantes, pero es que Cervantes no estuvo en ninguna universidad, no tuvo estudios universitarios, ¿de acuerdo? Pero él, en el Quijote, habla muchísimo, en la segunda parte del Quijote, habla muchísimo de la ciudad de Salamanca, de sus estudiantes, y dice que Salamanca es la cuna, el origen de los saberes en España, donde todo se estudia en Salamanca. Todas las ciencias, todos los saberes, incluidas las ciencias ocultas, las ciencias del diablo.
It's really not easy to describe in such a short time what Salamanca is, but it's one of the oldest cities, and it's synonymous to university, a university that has grown for over 8 centuries, one of the oldest in Europe and the oldest in Spain. As I said, it's basically a university city wherein you can't understand one without the others. But Salamanca is also a tale of two cities, one in the surface and one that cannot be seen. What we all see is the official one, the one of the buildings, the one of the universities, the one of the cathedrals. But there's another one which is beneath it, which is unknown. And I think, in a great extent, part of what I write in the El Manuscrito de Piedra, it's about that. The unknown, the one that's hidden. And I mentioned the word piedra, which, as you know, means stone, and that's very central to Salamanca, because most of the structures are done in stone, but it's a very particular stone which is very grainy, so it allows you to build edifices, but also you can, it's a material for sculpture, so you can do many designs with it. It's a stone called the stone of Villamayor. And I think that that's important also for us, is that Salamanca is the place of where all the authors, all the professors, many of the Latin American thinkers studied or taught our work, and one of them is the protagonist of one of my novels, Fernando Rojas, who, as you all know, is the author of La Celestina. I said almost everybody's there. There's one very notable person who did not study in Salamanca, who is Miguel de Cervantes. But Cervantes was so great that he cannot be confined to a single city. But if you go to Quixote, in the second volume, he devotes a lot of time and writes about Salamanca, the students, and he says that Salamanca is the cradle of knowledge. All what we know can be found there, whether those in the surface, like science, theology, philosophy, or those of the occult science. All can be sourced from Salamanca.
Okay. Should I follow up before I go to Dean? So one more question. You said there is the Salamanca that is known, and the Salamanca that seems to be the underbelly. And this is the Salamanca in your novels. Can you describe that kind of, that Salamanca? When I read a crime novel, the setting is very important. So what does the place Salamanca stand for in your novels? Because it's a very conscious choice to choose Salamanca, and very important in crime.
¿Qué sentido podemos dar en una novela como la suya? Un lugar, la parte oculta, la parte de superficie.
Sí, lo interesante de la ciudad de Salamanca es que esa parte oculta, esa parte invisible, se puede visualizar. Ahí hay una... No sé si lo veis. Esta es una cripta, la cripta de una antigua iglesia. La iglesia ha desaparecido totalmente, solamente queda la cripta. Bueno, pues esta cripta es la cueva de Salamanca, la entrada de la cueva de Salamanca. Se supone que toda la ciudad de Salamanca está llena de cuevas, de galerías, de pasadizos que conectan unos templos con otros, etcétera, ¿no? Y yo es lo que he intentado visualizar en la novela. O sea, que la parte oculta, la parte prohibida, esa parte es como el subconsciente de la ciudad, ¿no? Igual que dentro de nosotros hay una parte consciente, una parte subconsciente, la ciudad también tiene un subconsciente. Y en el subconsciente es donde está toda la parte prohibida, oculta, etcétera. Por eso es verdad que para mí en mis novelas el lugar, el espacio, es muy importante, porque es lo que nos permite ver, visualizar determinadas ideas, determinados estados del espíritu, de la conciencia. Y eso es lo que tiene Salamanca, que no tienen otras ciudades. O sea, no solo la ciudad que visitan los turistas, sino también una parte más escondida que viene desde el origen de los tiempos, no solo desde la Edad Media. En Salamanca hay una leyenda que es la cueva de Salamanca, y esa leyenda tiene que ver con las enseñanzas del diablo. Pero esa leyenda medieval viene desde la antigüedad, y hay libros que dicen que Salamanca fue fundada por Hércules, ¿no? El gran héroe de la antigüedad clásica, fundador de muchas ciudades y fundador también de Salamanca. Pero lo que funda en Salamanca no es una ciudad, es una universidad. Hace una cueva y en esa cueva deposita los libros de los grandes saberes de la antigüedad. Ese es el origen de Salamanca. Por lo tanto, la ciudad de la sabiduría, la universidad, pero también la ciudad mágica. Por eso Salamanca aquí tiene que ver con la magia, y eso tiene que ver con la leyenda de la cueva de Salamanca. Por lo tanto, es una ciudad muy rica, muy compleja, y es de lo que tratan mis novelas. Mis novelas hablan no solo de personajes, no solo cuentan una historia de crímenes, de asesinatos, sino también intento que los lectores vean, visualicen esta ciudad tan compleja. Las dos ciudades, la de arriba, la de abajo.
It's very interesting what you have, the question you posed. Yes, indeed, there is a hidden Salamanca, but a hidden Salamanca that it's not that hard to visualize. That actually it's available to visualize, and that's what we did. In fact, if you see that cover, there's a crypt in the book he showed. That is the crypt of the church. The church is gone, but the crypt remains, and the crypt is believed to be the gate to that under Salamanca. And it's a door to the cave that opens, that leads to many galleries, that leads to many alleys, a whole network of tunnels that interconnect the major structures of the city. But of course, being beneath, being underground, it talks more about the forbidden part of the city. I think, yes, as you say, the setting is essential because it can help us visualize. But I think it's also the underground is like in the mind. There's something in the underground of the mind which are unconscious or subconscious, but which is operating. So I try to depict that same mental structure with whatever is the history of the city. The city is really old, okay? And of course, it dates to the Middle Ages. But even before that, tradition has it that it had a longer history than what we know. Even it draws back to the antiquity, and it's said that it was one of the Herculean tasks done by Hercules was to do this city. Actually, not the city. What he created or built was a university. He made a cave, and there he put all the books, all the knowledge, all the teachings of the known of the underworld. In those caves, there was it's said that the prime lecturer was the devil who would instruct on those other kind of knowledges. Okay, and yes, indeed, my novels are rich in describing the city, because I think they're not only about the protagonists, they're not only about the crimes, but I think the setting is very important to understand what actually takes place.
Thank you. So, Dean, in contrast, although your novel and stories are Filipino, and it's interesting is the Salamanca here refers to a place, and your novel Salamanca actually refers to magic. Okay, so reading your work, it feels like it's nowhere yet, it's everywhere. Picking up from example, a title like How to Traverse Tierra Incognita. If there's a specific place you are writing from, which is it? Or you have once been described as an advocate of literature of the imagination. If place is the fantastic, why do you prefer it as a storytelling method, perhaps?
Good afternoon. So first of all, what do I write? I write what is called speculative fiction. So that's the umbrella term we use that encapsulates fantasy, science fiction, horror, magical realism, things that require you to be not where you are in terms of where you live. So place is critical. It's so important when you write what we call spec fic. All readers, but most especially the young readers who love fantasy, have what we call their favorite place. So whether this is Middle-earth from Tolkien, or Narnia from C.S. Lewis, or Arrakis from Dune, these are worlds that are written or created by various authors, which have become the setting for various stories and the characters that live there. The interesting thing is when you are a young reader, you are also looking for your place in the world as you're growing up. So you feel a bit unmoored. Try to remember how you were when you were much younger, when you were a teenager, when you were still looking for your place in the world. Didn't books give you some pleasure, some comfort? So for a lot of people, but most especially young readers, being able to dive into a book which has a strong setting, or what we call a world, is comforting. Because when you are a teenager, you are dealing with all the issues of growing up. You have your identity as a child or daughter or son. You have your sexual identity that you're dealing with. You have your identity as a person, part of the community, perhaps even your church, in your friend group, in your school, right? But when you encounter a book that has a strong sense of place, it offers you comfort against the chaos. And you're able to imagine yourself walking through Hogsworth, okay? And you are a member of Hufflepuff, or I don't know what you prefer, okay? Slytherin, that's me. So this is so important to me as a writer, and this is what I encourage when I teach speculative fiction, how to write it. Once upon a time, it was called setting, formally. So it's the place, the literal place, and the time. That is as simple as a definition can get. But now we call it world building, because it's more than just a place. It's more than just a time. It's also the language, the culture, the economics, the politics, the entire art scene, the music, the colors, the food, everything. So if this is done very well by a very caring and careful author, the world becomes big and inhabitable, not only by the characters in the stories, but also by the readers. And this is critical. But I need to tell you that this is not unique to speculative fiction. Realist fiction also does this, but it's a bit easier for the realist writers because you reference Manila or Madrid, it's already here, right? But when you create what we call a secondary world, which is you build from scratch, okay, that is where you are challenged as a writer because you need to be able to provide for the reader a beautiful place. The technical term is cosm, and as a reader, you collect cosms from different books, and they all are in your mind. And when you are lonely or struggling or trying to find or make your way through the world or make sense of the chaos, all these cosms, they comfort you. You can even put them all together, mash them up into a paracosm, and then you know what? You can find your tribe. You can find other people who love that book, who love that story. And in finding another person like you, you're able to find some strength. And you begin to build your identity as you continue your journey towards becoming an adult. And that is why I think the setting or the world is very, very important. And that is where I write from. That's it.
Thank you. Thanks, Dean. Okay, so Luis, you seem to be picking up historical figures to base your crime novels on. And these historical figures seem to have a keen sense of justice or they've been persecuted. First, I think you need to give us a background of Fernando de Rojas, who is also a writer like you. Also went to the University of Salamanca, as you said, graduating with a degree in law in 1498. And in 1499, published, as Chaco also said, La Celestina. And this particular novel was also described as a drama, a dramatic poem, a dialogue novel, a novel drama. Apparently, also a writer like you who fuses genres. And then his family was persecuted in the Inquisition. Then you have also Miguel de Unamuno, a poet, a philosopher, politician, one-time rector of the University of Salamanca, removed from his position of rector by the Ministry of Education for political reasons, namely for insulting the king. And the dictator Miguel Primo de Rivera. So all of them have a connection also to the university. Why do you take these historical figures and turn them into detectives in your novels? What inspires you to bring them to life in your books? Perhaps a short background as well of these historical figures?
Y a lo mejor también, para los que no conocemos, ¿quiénes son todas esas figuras históricas?
Empezaremos por Fernando de Rojas, que es el más antiguo. Bueno, Fernando de Rojas, ya hemos dicho que es uno de los grandes escritores de la literatura española, es el autor de La Celestina. La Celestina es el segundo libro más importante de la literatura española, después del Quijote. Lo interesante de Fernando de Rojas es que no sabemos casi nada sobre él. Es un misterio, es un enigma. La historia de la literatura española está llena de misterios, de enigmas. Y este es uno de los más importantes. Y eso es lo que me interesó. ¿Cómo es posible que no sepamos nada del segundo autor más importante de la literatura española? No hay biografías. No se pueden hacer esas biografías. No hay datos, no hay documentos, no se sabe nada.
Is he real?
Seguro que existió.
No es seguro. O sea, existió un Fernando de Rojas, pero a lo mejor no fue el autor de la Celestina. ¿De acuerdo? Entonces, claro, yo lo que he intentado es darle vida, no hacer una biografía falsa, no, darle vida, es decir, convertirlo en personaje literario, explicar cómo pudo ser esa vida oscura, oculta de Fernando de Rojas. Luego lo convertí en un detective, en un investigador que tiene que investigar crímenes. En español existe una palabra que es pesquisidor. Pesquisidor es el que hace pesquisas, es el que investiga crímenes o delitos. Entonces, Fernando de Rojas es un pesquisidor. Yo creo que eso lo hace muy atractivo para los lectores. Yo escribo para todo tipo de lectores, no solamente para lectores universitarios, sino para todo tipo de lectores. Y el hecho de convertirlo en detective lo hace atractivo, porque en España las novelas de crímenes, las novelas policíacas, son muy leídas por muchos lectores, ¿no? Entonces, lo importante es que a través de esa investigación criminal, pues tú vas siguiendo la vida de Fernando de Rojas, conociendo la época de Fernando de Rojas. Muy importante, la época es la época de los reyes católicos, es la época en la que se construye eso que luego se va a llamar España. Por lo tanto, es el final de la Edad Media, el comienzo de la Edad Moderna. Es una edad llena de conflictos. Yo creo que es la época más interesante desde el punto de vista histórico de la historia de España. Y bueno, eso en cuanto a Fernando de Rojas. El caso de Unamuno es un escritor del siglo XX, un intelectual. El caso es muy distinto porque de Unamuno lo sabemos todo o casi todo. De modo que yo ahí no quería descubrir nada nuevo, pero Unamuno me parece la figura española más interesante, por lo menos del siglo XX. ¿De acuerdo? Es un gran intelectual, un intelectual comprometido con la sociedad española de su tiempo y un autor al que le interesaba mucho la verdad, descubrir la verdad y contarla. Y eso es lo que va a hacer que, pues sus ataques contra el rey Alfonso XIII, pues lo van a llevar a ser juzgado, desterrado, o sea, echado fuera de su ciudad, de Salamanca, a una pequeña isla de las Islas Canarias, Fuerteventura, e incluso, según mi hipótesis, esa pasión por la verdad que tenía Unamuno es lo que lo va a llevar a ser asesinado el 31 de diciembre de 1936, plena Guerra Civil Española, cuando el ejército de Franco estaba en Salamanca. Allí es donde muere Unamuno. Por cierto, ya que estamos en Filipinas, ya que estamos en Manila, la razón por la que van a asesinar a Unamuno es por haber mencionado a José Rizal en un famoso incidente que ocurrió el 12 de octubre de 1936. El 12 de octubre se celebraba eso que se llamaba el descubrimiento de América, del Nuevo Mundo. Se llamaba el Día de la Hispanidad, se llamaba el Día de la Raza. Y hubo un acto solemne en la Universidad de Salamanca, presidido por Unamuno. Estaba la mujer de Franco, estaba lleno de militares, lleno de fascistas españoles, y en ese acto Unamuno defendió y habló muy bien de José Rizal. Pero en esa sala de la Universidad de Salamanca estaba José Millán Astray, el fundador de la Legión Española, una persona llena de heridas, de mutilaciones, le faltaba un brazo, le faltaba un ojo, le faltaban muchas partes del cuerpo. Y José Millán Astray conocía muy bien a José Rizal, porque José Millán Astray vino a Manila en el mismo barco donde trajeron a José Rizal para ser juzgado y fusilado. O sea, se conocían. Entonces José Rizal, para Millán Astray y para los militares de Franco, era un traidor. Había traicionado a España. Por eso yo creo que a Unamuno lo asesinaron por haber defendido a Rizal. Pero él lo hizo de manera consciente, de manera intencionada. Él quería provocar a Franco y a los militares de Franco, recordándoles a José Rizal, que era una persona que amaba la lengua y la cultura española, aunque fuera el gran defensor de Filipinas, el ideólogo de la independencia de Filipinas, pero decía Unamuno que él amaba la lengua española y la hablaba mejor que todos los que estaban allí presentes en ese momento. Perdón por haber sido tan...
You all got it now, Andy. Well, why? These are two different characters which I've chosen. One is, yes, Fernando de Rojas. He is one of the greatest authors of Spain. He wrote Las Celestinas, has been mentioned a number of times, and that's the second most important book of Spanish literature. But unlike Cervantes, we hardly know him. We have no facts about him. There's no written biography. There are no data that can suffice. So he is an enigma. He is a mystery, and that is, I think, what drew me towards him. And what I try to do is to bring him to life. And say I'm bringing him to life because I'm making a character out of him. I am not writing his biography. I am bringing him to life. By making him a character of a novel. He was, among other things, he was like, for lack of a better word, like a detective. He was an investigator, a private investigator. And we know that this kind of genre of crimes and police and detectives are very attractive to the Spanish audience. So I thought that by bringing him in that dimension, I would reach out to audiences of many different ages in Spain. I think also that what, for lack of a better word, what we do the setting is very important because it's a critical moment in the Spanish history, which is the period of the Reyes Católicos. This is where what we currently know as Spain starts to be forged. It's the beginning of Spain as we know it. So the setting and the character were very important. Then you bring me in time to the 20th century, to Miguel de Unamuno, someone who we know almost everything about. So it was very difficult for me to try to discover something that was not known. He was a great intellectual. He was a very committed intellectual with the people, and he was enamored and faithful to the truth. And he was determined to discover the truth at any cost and disseminate it. Maybe in that process of not discovering, but probably of dissemination, that led him to trouble because he was very clear about things like the monarchy and concretely King Alfonso the 13th. Okay, and that probably brought him to his death in 1936. By the way, this happens in December 31, 1936, so it's 40 years and a day after Jose Rizal is executed in Valle. Was it by chance? Was it by design? I leave it to you. The thing is that he gave a very important speech on October 12 in Salamanca. It's an important speech on the date because October 12 is a meaningful day for Spanish history. It's the day that we discovered the new continent, but has had many names. The day of Hispanism, of Hispanity, the day of the race, It has come, but the day he speaks there in Salamanca, he is talking in a very effervescent moment in the midst of the civil war, with a very important audience. Among them was the wife of the General Franco and the cohort of fascists. And in that, he probably deliberately exalts the person of Jose Millán Astrain, who said, mind you, he might have been the champion of Philippine independence, but he was enamored with our culture and language, and I dare to say that he spoke Spanish better than any and all of you here together. Among those who were there was a military man who started the Spanish Legion, Jose Millán Astrain, who was no stranger to Jose Rizal, because he happened, when he was 17 years old, he happened to be traveling from Spain to the Philippines in the same ship that would bring Jose Rizal here, only to meet his fate. For a military of his orientation, he could see Rizal only as a traitor, someone who had turned his back onto Spain. And I dare to say that this is the beginning of the end of Unamuno. That is where probably he signed his death sentence, because Millán Astrain would not take it lightly that someone like Unamuno would be praising in front of this audience a traitor to Spain, which was, to his eyes, Jose Rizal.
Before I leave, Luis, okay, because you mentioned what Miguel de Unamuno heartily believed, that the truth is more important than many things. For example, okay, Vincent, don't go there. Should I not? I already started. I'm already here. We're gonna dive in. Okay, in fiction. In your fiction, what is the truth that you want to say? And maybe modeling from Miguel de Unamuno, what did you want to do with that particular novel, taking him as the historical figure as your protagonist in that last one, El Primer Caso?
Una pregunta interesante, aunque muy complicada, muy compleja, pero, a ver, yo no, en mis novelas no busco, y en general en la literatura, cuando yo leo, no busco la verdad. Yo no quiero ofrecer la verdad, es decir, en mis novelas yo no doy respuestas a las grandes preguntas, sino más bien lo que hago son preguntas, o más bien lo que hago es cuestionar la realidad, cuestionar la existencia, cuestionar algunas cosas. O sea, no busco la verdad. Lo único que busco, dado que yo escribo novela histórica, no novela fantástica, sino lo que busco en mis novelas es dar la sensación de verosimilitud, es decir, de que lo que ahí se cuenta, aunque no ocurriera, pudo haber ocurrido. O sea, en realidad es el mismo planteamiento que Dean Francis, pero hacia atrás, hacia la novela, hacia el pasado histórico. ¿De acuerdo? Pero no busco la verdad. Lo único que busco es un poco entender un poquito mejor el presente. O sea, a mí me interesa el pasado, hago novela histórica, porque es una manera de conocer un poco el presente. El presente que para mí es incertidumbre, perplejidad, confusión. Entonces, gracias a la literatura, uno se puede mover un poquito en esa incertidumbre, en esa confusión, en ese caos de que habla el título de la charla, ¿no? Pero no busco la verdad. La frase que ha citado es de Unamuno. Unamuno decía, primero la verdad que la paz, pero en el sentido siguiente. Él lo que quería era buscar la verdad incómoda, la verdad oculta, la verdad escondida, lo que no se puede decir. Eso era la verdad. Aunque para ello él perdiera la paz. O sea, no hablaba de la paz social, de la paz mundial, hablaba de su paz. Él estaba siempre en lucha con los demás y consigo mismo. ¿Por qué? Porque prefería buscar la verdad. Para él era más importante buscar la verdad. Esa es un poco la idea. No engañarse a sí mismo, sino estar siempre buscando la verdad. Y eso es una manera de estar en el mundo muy difícil, muy complicada. ¿De acuerdo? Pero bueno, eso es Unamuno. En mi caso lo que busco es contar historias que sean interesantes, historias en las que se plantean preguntas, se plantean problemas y luego cada lector o lectora pues encontrará sus respuestas, sus soluciones.
That is both a very interesting and a complex question that you pose. But if to go to the center of what you're saying, when I write and when I read, I'm not in the search of truth. This is not what drives me, okay? I am not here to provide answers, but to raise questions. And yes, I do historically based novel, which is different from a speculative fiction, but I do it, how would I say it, to maybe as a discipline to understand the current time better by knowing the past. That is my interest. And we all know that we live in a very uncertain, the present is uncertain, complex, perplex, confusion. So it might be a set of skills to be able to navigate through that chaos. That's what I do. Yes, you quoted very well Miguel de Ramos, that truth precedes or comes is greater or higher level than peace. Because he was speaking of what we could call the inconvenient or uncomfortable truth, the one that leads to a struggle. He was fighting inside himself in finding the truth. That struggle was not only internal, but with the people around him. It was a process, a search, and that is what he's trying to say, that I have to, if that comes at the price of not finding my peace or the peace of others, we're not about Miss Universe World Peace. We're talking about that anxiety that you have, so be it, provided I am in this search of discovering the truth. So, I am not Unamuno. I simply tell stories. I raise questions, I raise issues, and maybe, just maybe, the readers will find answers.
I'm going to throw a sort of the same question to Dean. How do you come up with your characters and your stories? Like Luis, are they sort of based on the real as well? A couple of your characters, for example, eat mermaids, so I don't know how they are based on real people.
How do I create characters that are memorable? First, I need to understand what sort of story I'm writing. So I'll just give you an example. Most recently, one of my short stories was adapted as a play. It's called How Rosang Taba Won a Race, which was staged down there. Yes, I wrote that. So, if you've seen it, you know that it's actually a very simple story. But I wanted to create a very big character. So, what is the story about? In my head, before I wrote that, I wanted to do the following things. Number one, set it at the time towards the end, or rather at the beginning of the Filipino resistance against Spanish colonialism. Big. Number two, I wanted the protagonist to be a woman. 3, I wanted the protagonist to be a fat person. 4, I wanted the protagonist to have some issues with parents, and so on. I had a laundry list. So, Rosang Taba is a fat woman who is a servant of the Gobernador General. And she inevitably is insulted by one of the flowers of what I call the Espancialo. The champion fencer, runner, macho man. And she challenges him and says that I can beat you in something. And the Spaniard looks at her and says, "You? Ang taba mo? Babae ka? And katao ka. You are not us. What can you do? You can do nothing." And she says, "I am not worthless. I am worth something." And she challenges him to a race with a condition that she gets to choose the course of the race, and he gives her 15 steps ahead. So I'll spoil it. Because she is Manileña, she understands the streets of Intramuros, and she knows the narrowest streets. And with 15 paces ahead, she is able to block him so that he cannot get past her. He hits her, curses her, kicks her, spits at her. But she, even bleeding through the walls, is the winner. To the cheers of all the Filipinos who saw a fat woman servant defeat the flower of Spanish rule. And for me, that is what the story I wanted to tell was. I needed a character. I didn't want a man. I didn't want a fit man. I didn't want to do a traditional thing of this Filipino guy going up. I wanted to have somebody that more people could relate to, because the story is set in the past, but my readers are here and now. I wanted them to be able to identify with that person. And because I am a father, I know what it's like to have kids who have questions and issues and insecurities. And because I once was 215 pounds myself, I know what it's like to be fat and to be shamed. And because I was bullied when I was young, I know what it's like to feel that way when there is someone superior or who thinks they are superior. So, do I put myself in my character? Do I put somebody I know in that character? Or do I invent somebody from whole cloth, from nothing? It's a combination. So I created Rosang Taba, and she won that race. And because of that, Rosang Taba the production is touring the Philippines. Even they filmed it, so it's being shown in the UP systems, in Iloilo, I think, and in Davao, in Mindanao at least. So, to circle back to the question, do I create characters from the real, from reality? Yes and no, because a lot of it is invention or imagination, but a lot of it is also the truth that I feel, because I've been hurt, and I know people who have been hurt. And if you invest that hurt and that understanding, that compassion, you can create a character that people will remember or identify with, like Rosang Taba. So that's how I write.
Should I throw it to the audience or ask one more question? Are you ready with questions, or ask one more question, then you think of questions, yeah? Okay. So, Luis.
Hace frío aquí.
Okay. So,
Se está muy bien aquí.
Napa-Spanish tuloy ako.
Questions you get? Do you have questions?
Tengo fear. It is cold here. I only have this.
Eso me recuerda a una cita de Mark Twain que decía, el peor invierno que pasé en mi vida es un verano que pasé en San Francisco.
That reminds me of a quote of
Mark Twain.
Said the worst winter I suffered was summer in San Francisco.
Aquí un invierno en Manila. El peor invierno que pasé en mi vida es un verano en Manila.
You're fine, but I'm really tropical. Really tropical. Tropical.
Okay, question, guys. Yes, over here.
Hello. I just have a question po, especially po to the recent trip that all characters deserve a happy ending po. Especially when you're creating it. And if ever the character does not have a happy ending po, what do you do with it po? Especially with the audience, like for example, in your story, The Kite of Stars, a lot of my, let's just say we had a discussion about it one time during class, and a lot of people were rooting for the butcher boy, but he ended up very lonely, old, and sad. How do you deal with setting the ending of your characters, and in a way, does it affect you as well? Especially when you said that the character, you put yourself into your character, you put what you know and what you've tried to invent into that character po. Other than that, that's all. Thank you.
It's a rather specific question. All right. Yes, I wrote The Kite of Stars. And for those who are not very familiar, in a nutshell, it's a love story. It's a story of love and longing, and who you think will get together do not get together. So, yes, I know how hurtful it was. I get this question all the time because people have been reading it in schools, and a lot of young people feel the heartache. And I'm sorry to say that unhappy ending is the unhappy ending for the butcher's boy. Why? Because my heart has also been broken, and yours will too. Honestly, you're very lucky if you're young and your heart is never broken, but you would not have really lived life if your heart is not broken. So, for him, I gave the unhappy ending of having his heart broken and setting him on a path of longing, because we all need to understand that we can go on, that we are all broken, but we patch ourselves up, and somehow we will make it. Not everybody gets a happy ending immediately. Some people have to work for it. But the important thing is that we hope for it. So, to take a step back, do all characters deserve a happy ending? They believe so. The characters believe so. But you have to understand that fiction, unlike real life, needs to make sense. The chaos part of what we're talking about is in real life, it doesn't make sense, right? But in fiction, it does. So, there are characters who will get the happy endings. You root for them, they go through obstacles, they get it. Whether it is the standard boy-girl, or BL, or girl-girl, or trans, whatever. Okay? But there are also the villainous characters. You cannot give them happy endings because they're villains. They're only heroes in their own minds. Okay? But the important thing and the takeaway here is we each pursue our endings. And when you have your ending, surprise, it's not the end. It's actually the beginning, right? When you say happily ever after, it's not the end of that story. It continues. So that's why I write stories like that. There is a lot of expectation because it's built up, and it's devastating, I know, because my own kids cried. The first reader for my stories that are sad are my wife and my kids. And if I break them down, then it's successful. I will sell this.
Luis, do you have anything to add to that? Don't mind him being cold. It's okay.
No, no te preocupes, que pase frío. Tú sigue hablando, dice que pase frío, dice él.
Seguimos, ¿eh?
Okay. Any more questions?
Thank you.
It's only 3:30. Should I go on? Keep going. See, he says keep going. 5 more minutes, one more. Okay, just a minute, one more. No, we started late. Okay. So, Luis. Question. I'm sorry.
Hello po. For both writers, I wanted to ask, as someone who's also aspiring to be a published author one day, how do you go about developing a unique voice for your character? Because I feel that a character's voice is always what sets them apart or what makes them the most recognizable. So how do you go about developing that voice and making sure that you're not projecting too much of yourself into that person, so you get to keep yourself separate from the character? So what are some tips you have on that in regards to writing?
Bueno, es una pregunta muy complicada que tiene que ver con eso que llamamos la cocina del escritor, ¿no? Escribir es como cocinar y se trata de mezclar ingredientes, elementos, y en este caso, pues quizá en una novela, en un relato, lo más difícil es dar una voz personal a cada personaje, ¿no? Porque además los personajes, en realidad todos nosotros, pero en los personajes está claro que están hechos de palabras, solo son esas palabras, solo son lo que ellos dicen o lo que los demás personajes dicen de ellos o el narrador, pero el narrador es el menos fiable de todos, ¿no? De modo que, bueno, ahí es una operación de búsqueda de un lenguaje propio. Cada personaje se distingue de los demás, sobre todo por su lenguaje propio. Entonces, pues para eso, un poco yo lo que trato de hacer, yo no planifico mucho mis novelas. Cuando empiezo a escribir, yo no tengo un plan, no tengo un esquema, no tengo fichas con los personajes, con su vida, su edad, su retrato, sino que intento ir creando la novela conforme se va haciendo la novela. Y en este sentido es muy importante darle iniciativa a los personajes, que sean un poco los personajes los que se vayan haciendo a sí mismos en la novela. Dejarles hablar y dejarles que sigan su camino. Y tú a veces quieres llevar el personaje por un lado, pero el personaje se va por otro, ¿de acuerdo? Se va haciendo a sí mismo. Y se va haciendo a sí mismo pues a través del lenguaje, porque el lenguaje que utiliza, su manera de hablar, pues refleja su manera de ser y refleja su visión del mundo. De modo que quizá es lo más difícil. No sé qué pensará mi colega de la mesa, pero lo más difícil es darle a cada personaje su voz propia, para que no ocurra lo que tú decías, que parece que todos los personajes hablan igual y que todos los personajes son una proyección del autor. Pero no se trata de eso. La novela se trata de crear personajes distinguibles y los personajes están hechos exclusivamente de palabras.
A good and a very complicated question that you put. What you're talking here is about the author in the kitchen, choosing the ingredients that he or she will put together in his novel. Yeah, it's very important to find a unique voice, as you said, for each and every of the characters. But the characters are the words they use. They define themselves by what they say. Sometimes by what the narrator says, but normally the narrator, I wouldn't trust what the narrator says so much as what the character says. It is really a process. It's a process of search. I have to accept that I do not plan that much. I don't have a scheme of how to unfold. I don't have cards and I add characteristics or profile of the characters. It's more evolutive. It's an ex itinere process. And I think that the authors find their own life. Sometimes you try to bring them somewhere, and that character fights against what you are writing about him or her, and defines himself, find his own path or her own path. And that path is defined by the language that he or she chooses. And mind you, what you've actually asked is the most difficult part of the whole process, because there is the risk that all of them, all the characters, are just mere projections or clones of you. So how do you give them that unique voice that's not only your projection? That is the million-dollar question. I don't know what my colleague would want to add on this.
It is the most difficult, I agree. Especially if, first of all, thank you so much for warmth. I feel warmer already. Okay. It is the most difficult, especially if you're writing at length, if it's a novel, especially if you're building a world and you have many characters. Okay. I can only give you advice in practical terms. If you have a lot of characters in your cast, focus on a few. Okay? 2 or 3 at most. The rest, don't worry so much. Because if you take a look at your own life, and this is important because there's a concept called verisimilitude, which means like life, right? Verisimilitude is important when you write fiction because you want to persuade the readers that this is real, that this is happening, right? So, if you take a look at yourself and the people around you, when you talk to people, when you meet people, is everybody you know a unique person who speaks in a very special way with very special words and a special accent? Is this true? Is everybody you meet like that? Take a look at your friend group. It's possible that in a group of 5, there's one quirky one, but everybody will be using the same words, the same terms, right? It's when you go outside in a different community that you'll find differences. But they're not that dramatic unless you travel to another place. Let's say from Manila you go to Madrid. Of course, it's going to be very different. Of course, the people will sound different because they are different people coming from a different place. So, in a nutshell, those 2 or 3 people, characters that you'll focus on, make sure that you give them enough of a background, even in your head, so that they come from a place. They grew up somewhere. Because they may have a cultural or religious belief that they feel strongly about. Then they will speak for you. They will not be you. Okay? So, it's hard to explain. It's easier actually. No, it's even harder to execute. Okay? But that's basically what I do. It also helps that I have had years of role-playing game experience because I write campaigns and stories and I'm the game master. So I'm an actor and a director and a producer and the set designer and the music guy. So it is a transferable skill to writing. But like anything that's produced, that's art and that tells a story or is a narrative, whether it's a book or a movie or a play, there are lead characters and supporting characters and background characters. You don't need to worry about making everybody speak uniquely because they won't have lines. They're just background. All right? Don't worry about it, and don't worry about you as the author revealing yourself. That is a trait of a very young writer. As you write, you'll improve. And you will be able to let the characters speak for themselves. As my colleague Luis said, when you are an author in the kitchen, you get to put ingredients. You only think you are in control. The characters, if you put them in a situation, they will either follow what you want or they will rebel. They will do their own things, and then your beautiful outlined story goes left and crashes and becomes something else. Sometimes that accident is a beautiful accident, and it can blossom into something completely unexpected. As a creative and as a writer, you should open yourself to that and not get frustrated. Because if you are lucky enough to have a strong character that guides your story, then that is a story I think that is worth writing and definitely worth reading.
Maybe to add to that, I'm going to ask about the way they chose to write. No? So Luis here has fused crime with the historical novel. So I read somewhere that you call it period crime. Not quite the historical thriller or not the historical mystery. So that's different even in the genre. And Dean here, as many of us know, is the champion of speculative fiction in the Philippines. So I would like to ask both of them, given that they're writing distinctly, not just with a conscious, distinct voice, but a conscious, distinct way in their own genres. Is this the way you distinguish yourself? Is this a subversion of sorts that you have done, let's say, vis-a-vis the crime genre, and you vis-a-vis realism, for example, or the way people in the Philippines write?
Sí, además esto es de lo que trataba un poco es el tema de la mesa, efectivamente. Los dos hacemos literatura de género, novela de género, pero creo que yo no he leído nada, desgraciadamente, de mi colega, pero entiendo que los dos hacemos ese género de una manera muy particular. De hecho, yo no me he considerado nunca un novelista histórico o un novelista policíaco. Esas son etiquetas que ponen los críticos literarios o que ponen en las librerías. En las librerías tu libro hay que colocarlo en algún sitio, o bueno, los periodistas, etcétera, ¿no? O sea, yo hago novelas. Como mis personajes son históricos y me interesa la época en la que vivieron esos personajes, inevitablemente mis novelas son históricas. Pero también son novelas policíacas o criminales, porque siempre me gusta que haya una trama policíaca para mover a esos personajes. Entonces, bueno, dentro de estos géneros, en el caso de la novela histórica y policíaca, sobre todo la novela policíaca, está de moda ahora en España, hay muchos autores que hacen novela policíaca, demasiados, diría yo. Yo he encontrado mi camino, mi territorio, pues mezclando diferentes géneros, diferentes elementos. En mis novelas siempre tiene mucha importancia la literatura. La literatura quiere decir, los protagonistas son escritores, generalmente, la mayoría, y además del protagonista aparecen otros escritores junto a ellos, de modo que el mundo cultural, el mundo literario está muy presente en mis novelas. Eso ya es algo muy específico dentro de la novela policíaca española y la novela histórica, ¿no? Y ese es un poco el territorio en el que yo me muevo. Alguien dijo que el escritor escribe de aquello que conoce. Yo no he sido aventurero ni explorador, no he descubierto ningún territorio nuevo. Yo lo que he hecho durante toda mi vida es escribir y leer, sobre todo leer. Los escritores, antes que nada, somos lectores. Y de lo que sé un poquito es de libros, de literatura. De modo que por eso acabé convirtiendo a escritores en protagonistas de mis novelas. Eso es una peculiaridad también. Entonces, bueno, uno va encontrando su voz escribiendo. Y es muy importante encontrar la voz, porque es lo mismo que encontrar un territorio. O sea, dentro de la historia dentro de la literatura, el campo de la literatura, que es muy, muy amplio, pues uno tiene que encontrar su territorio específico. Y ese territorio está hecho pues de estas cosas que hemos mencionado, ¿no? De estas pequeñas cosas, de la manera que tienes de tratar un género. O sea, un género por sí mismo no significa nada, es la manera como tú escribes dentro de ese género. Un género es un código, y nosotros lo que intentamos hacer es romper ese código, porque donde está la originalidad, donde está lo personal y lo específico, es en la ruptura del código. De la misma manera que hablaba mi colega de los personajes, ¿no? Esos personajes que tú llevas por un lado, pero que se van por el otro lado. Tienen vida propia. La novela, los personajes, pero no solo los personajes, las novelas tienen que tener vida propia. Y ahí es donde está la originalidad de cada autor, en esa vida propia que tiene la novela, no en haber copiado unos modelos específicos.
I think it's a very timely observation, because it really sums up the theme that we're here on this. Yes, we all write novels. Unfortunately, I've not read any of the novels of Dean, but looking into myself, yes, indeed, the settings are, you could say that I do historical novel, because I do it there in a certain period of time. They are crime and detective, so I'm trying to put this and mix them together. And this is about labels. Di parang showbiz na walang labels, okay? This is about labels. It's something that the publishers need. Yes. And the people who's in the bookshelves, in what shelf do I put? I don't write in that genre, but we have to put it somewhere. What a book critic labels, it's not us. It's okay. I don't do it like following a certain label. But I will agree that I come from two clear backgrounds, which is one of the historical characters, and that there's a detective or a crime or a police story in it. So it's a mix of genres. But I think what is important is that makes it different from theirs, that the protagonists are authors, are literary figures. I think that might make me different from other persons. Aside that I mix two things, I already take a certain characters. Among Us, I have not discovered something, going to extreme sports, doing any adventure, so I cannot write about that. We write about what we are. And what I have been doing in my life is writing and mostly reading. And that is why I bring writers into my plays. And I think that those characters will find, it's important to find our own voice. And we find our own voice in that process. I think, and we're a summation of all those things, of all those experiences. And I think if, the same way that my colleague here says that when you're writing a book and then suddenly the character turns to our left when he was supposed to go straight or turn right, and that is what happens to us in our creative process. And sometimes you don't find the next page that where you would sum up. I know there was another thing, but I think that the important thing is, I hope it's important, must be important because I forgot it already, is that the novel takes its own path. And that defines it. That is not a predictable thing that you have been writing about. The same way that those characters behave in a different way, the novels have a life of their own and take you to somewhere where you're not supposed to get to.
So the question is speculative fiction as a version? Okay, I'll just keep it as short as possible because I could speak for hours on this thing. To begin, my UP student number is 8616653. Okay, 86. So when I was here and writing, I was writing what would be called speculative fiction, but there was no label then. I was writing fantasy stories and sci-fi and some folk tales and things like that. But at that time, the dominant genre was realism, domestic realism and social realism, especially social realism. So you'd have stories that are privileged, and they would be of little boys on the back of carabaos in a rice field under the stars, thinking of what's happening in the mountains because the NPAs are killing people there, that kind of thing. And that did not sit well with me, and it was an unpopular opinion. When I learned how to write better, I started looking for more books that I wanted to read. And there was a dearth of Filipino-authored books of what I wanted to read. Where were all the multi-novel fantasy books? Where are the Filipino science fiction books? Where are the beautifully thick Stephen King-esque horror novels? Okay, there were some, but very, very few. And so I decided one day I will write the stories that I want. So we just have to do a montage now. Montage of Dean through the years fighting. Because I did. I fought against a national artist. I fought against F. Chinil Jose, who called me out and said, "What is the value of this thing that you write? What is this?" Right? So I really went through melt. Okay, I went through terrible things. But that's not what I want to say here. What I want to say is, ultimately, after struggle, there came a day when my stories were in elementary school textbooks, in high school textbooks, in collegiate classes, and were being written about in masteral thesis. Okay? There came a point wherein publishers from Anvil to Milflores to all the other publishers were looking for speculative fiction. Because there was a time, wala. There was none. Okay? And I am proud to say that in a small way, I helped open the doors for a lot of young writers to feel free to write what they want without shame or being looked down upon by the dominant, establishment. And so now, there are classes on speculative fiction. Against my will, I am bothered on Facebook and Messenger by students who pester me with questions because they don't read. They just want the answers. So, is speculative fiction a subversion? First of all, speculative fiction. The stories we tell around the fire, the horror stories that you listen to in the provinces, our flights of fancy, our fantasy stories with heroes, are those new? They're old. They predated realism. They predate the novel. They predate this literary what have you. So they're actually older and more important. So, Do I think it's a subversion? No. It is a return to the stories that we really want to read, that we really want to listen to, that we really want to write. Because the young people of today, you cannot tell them to write only what they know. As a young person, what do you know? What experience do you have? And if you subscribe to that, you will never write anything because you can't, because you shouldn't. Speculative fiction is the fiction of the imagination. Write what you do not know. Invent it. Imagine it. Claim it. Make it real. Specfic.
So with that, roar. So with that, I think we will end our panel. Thank you very much to our wonderful authors and to Chaco for the wonderful translation.
Only towards the end did he lose a page. He's fantastic.
I'm very dramatic.
Okay, thank you. I need to stop.
Thank you all so much. Muchísimas gracias por haber estado aquí en nuestro coloquio de hoy. On behalf of Instituto Cervantes, we would like to thank the Department of European Languages and the Department of English and Comparative Literature of UP Diliman, as well as UP Vargas Museum for hosting the Manila leg of Benengeli 2024. Now we would like to invite everyone to go outside the patio. We have a little merienda with refreshments. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.
Outdoors?
Outdoors, sir. Tropical weather.
Muchas gracias.
So funny.
Muchas gracias.